My name is Jen Sinkler. On behalf of the Heart of Iowa Dems communications team, I'd like to thank you for being with us tonight or whenever you're watching the recording. We are excited and honored to welcome you to the third in this four-part series on climate change called Earth to Iowa. Tonight's jump-off point is soil health and everything that touches. We'll first hear talks from Sikowis Nobiss, Carolyn Raffensperger, and Steve Falck, followed by a conversation among the three, further addressing what's happening to the soil and thus us in Iowa and beyond. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items. You can view the transcript of this conversation by selecting live transcription on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We are live streaming this event on the Heart of Iowa Dems Facebook page. You can check the chat for that link should you want to invite anyone in now. And we will also post the recording on our YouTube channel by the same name, as well as email you the links for both for sharing and rewatching purposes. If a question comes up for you during any of the presentations or conversation that follows, drop it in the chat, click on the chat button in the toolbar. And now I'll introduce the forum participants for this evening. Sikowis Nobiss is founder and executive director of Great Plains Action Society, a collective of Indigenous organizers working to resist and indigenize colonial institutions, ideologies, and behaviors. And she works through a multitude of roles such as organizer and writer and speaker and artist. On the Great Plains Action Society's website, specifically at greatplainsaction.org/zines, you will see that in one of the zines Sikowis wrote and largely designed, along with artist Moselle Singh, is called End Stage Iowa, Big Ag Sacrifice Zone and Indigenous Resistance. In it, she approaches from a sound systems perspective, referring to the environmental catastrophe known as the state of Iowa, where the water is poisoned, animals are dying, the soil is disappearing, and the landscape is turning into a desert. That's literal. Where the Iowa used to be as biodiverse as a rainforest, as sourced by Iowa Prairie Network, it is now closer to desert thanks to industrial agricultural practices. The next panelist is Carolyn Raffensperger, an environmental lawyer and the executive director of the Science and Environmental Health Network, a consortium of organizations promoting safe scientific practices, as well as being a leading expert on the precautionary principle. A book she co-edited on how that topic relates to public health is called Protecting Public Health and the Environment, Implementing the Precautionary Principle. She coined the term ecological medicine as a thought and action approach that focuses on reconciling care for the health of ecosystems, populations, communities, and individuals. And the final panelist is Steve Falck, Senior Policy Advocate at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, where he's built a range of coalitions that focus on protecting natural resources by better supporting state and federal policies on water quality, soil health, and renewable energies such as solar. In an article published on the Environmental Law and Policy Center site in 2020, Steve named soil as the basis of our food system and rural economy and pointed out the ways long-term benefits of healthy soil are often neglected for short-term gain. He also quoted Henry A. Wallace as saying that no one has the right to destroy soil, even if he does own it in fee simple, and that soil requires a duty, which we have been slow to recognize. I am very interested in how the concept of ownership plays into and gets twisted around in these damaging agricultural practices as well. And with that, I'll bow out and turn it to Sikowis to get things going.
Tansi Mio Takosin, hello, good evening. My name is Sikowis Nobiss, and I am here today to provide my perspective, and I guess which is also an Indigenous perspective on this issue that we're facing in Iowa with the degradation of our soil and degradation. Oh, sorry, there's some kind of feedback or something. Yeah, so something's going on. Sorry. Can somebody turn off like this binging that's going on every time somebody comes in the room? Is that possible?
I will try. Okay. I will try.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay. So, I can also just put it on mute for myself too. So that's an idea. Okay. So yeah, I'm here today to talk about, just different, thoughts I've had and things I've learned, about the soil here in Iowa and the challenges, that we are facing, concerning soil health, the health of us, of humans, the health of the environment, the health of all of our relatives, our two-legged relatives, the relatives that fly and the relatives that live in the water, and then the rivers themselves, which I consider, and many Indigenous people consider to be a relative as well. And so I wanted to start my presentation off with just like a very short segment of a video that I consulted for the Pesticide Action Network. And so I'm going to just share my screen and let this play. And if you can give me 1 second here. Okay, here we go. Yes. There we go. Can you see that? Okay. I'm just going to play the first minute.
Let me tell you what farming was really like back then. In those days, we didn't just feed people. We actually managed our land and natural resources.
We nourished our communities with food that we grew and harvested in harmony with nature. We shared our huli and seeds freely and passed them on to the next generation.
Crops adapted so well to local conditions. Ecosystems were healthy, diverse, and abundant as our.
Then came the colonialists. They sold us the propaganda that our food systems and innovations weren't enough. Not enough to feed the world, not modern enough. The truth is, it just wasn't profitable enough for them. So they built plantations and brought in agrochemical and seed companies. Today, all over the world, these corporations dictate the entire way we produce our food.
So I just wanted to share the first minute of that video, which I think is very impactful and basically summarizes why we were having issues like we're having in Iowa, which is like severe toxicity of our soil, severe runoff of our soil, and so much more. I consulted with PAN on this project for quite some time, actually, the Pesticide Action Network. I think it was like a year and a half at least before they put this video together. And it was in consultation with Indigenous folks from all over the world, actually. So it took different perspectives from, not just here in North America, but even places in Asia and South America. And basically it gets into the details also of like, what pesticides are doing, and that is having a huge impact on our soil, right? So there's pesticide, there's herbicides, there's fertilizers, there's runoff from all of the CAFOs, the concentrated animal feed operations, and then there's just like the gross stuff that's coming out of ethanol plants and construction areas, cities, golf courses. I mean, like, the list is quite endless, and there's probably things I don't even know about, right, that are happening, that are going into our water. I just want to note that pesticides, are not just, like made of, what people would consider safe ingredients, right? They're some of them are even made with, petrochemicals. And so, there's a lot of really scary things going into our soil, which eventually gets into our water. The nitrates, the heavy metals, and the antibiotics from, the pig waste and all the other animal waste. And what's happening is that like it saturates our soil, right? And then our soil is under dire conditions because of the sheer colonization of the land here. So Iowa is the most biologically colonized state in the country, and it's mostly turned into farmland now. Most things are monocropped, soy and corn, and most of that, as probably everybody here knows, is grown for, ethanol and, animal feed and all that. I won't get too much into that detail, but the problem with that is these are all shallow root plants. And the difference between that and what used to be here, I don't know if you can hear the crow flying in the background, but it's really loud. The difference between that and what used to be here is that, tall grass prairie, which made up 80% of, Iowa's landscape, could really grow deep. Like some people say 12 feet deep, but the more research I do, like I've found that some people say it could grow as much as 25 feet deep, and these are hardy root systems that are unbelievably important. Not just important for keeping the soil and the layering, which is very important to what's going on in the earth, but also for sequestering carbon. And now that we don't have this anymore, now that most of this is gone, the soil is basically just being scraped off, when it rains. And unfortunately, as the climate changes, we're having more severe climate events, more severe weather events. So, it rains harder, the wind blows stronger. All of a sudden we're talking about deratios now, right? I'm sorry if I don't pronounce that right. And it's just things that the soil is going really fast into our waterways, and it eventually makes its way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And with that soil itself is the carrier of all of these toxins that is like getting into the water, right? Like the Iowa report came out and on cancer. I don't know the exact wording of this, but I think our rates are going up, right? And why is that? Well, because like look what's in our water, like look what's in our air, like look what gets sprayed all around all the time, right? And so that eventually makes its way down to the Mississippi River, and then into the Gulf of Mexico. And as I've been told and what I've researched, we are the #1 contributor to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And what's happening down there is like there's so much silt that is building up that like they don't even know what to do with it. And I was just told by a friend who's working with youth that are doing indigenous youth that are doing canoe journeys along the Mississippi, that in some places like it's getting hard to canoe through these areas, right? Because like the buildup is just getting to be so much. Obviously this isn't just because of Iowa, right? Like this is coming from all sorts of other states as well. The Mississippi is under direct attack, essentially, because we don't know how to treat our land. The Mississippi is the largest, river basin in the country, and it is a bringer of life. And right now, it is in big trouble. And so and it's because we don't know how to treat, basic aspects of our land, like our soil. We don't know how to treat it well. And so, there's people that are really suffering right now from this, that are in the South, that are, feeling the consequences of this. I was just in Louisiana, in New Orleans, presenting at an event, and talking about this, same stuff. And because we want to make this connection between what's happening here and what's happening down there. And like so many people like just talked about how bad it is in that part of the world. And there's many people that are working on this, right? That another Gulf is possible. The Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, Taproot, the Babancha Collective. There's many people that are doing good things, but it's not enough if we don't make the connection between what's happening here and what's happening there. I'm actually organizing right now, along with somebody that I brought on to help organize with me, Mosel Singh, who's an amazing artist and organizer, a Mississippi River Summit. And that's going to be actually held next weekend. And I was speaking to some of the folks that we're going to be bringing up from Cancer Alley, which is like down in the southern part. In the actually, starts in New Orleans and goes a bit north. And they're in the St. James Parish. And, one of the younger women said to me, I can't wait to go because I've never seen the Mississippi as a clear river, you know, and so like they're super excited to come here and just look at the river in the Quad Cities to see it as clear water. Not saying that it's always clear here, but that, like, you know, when you generally drive over it, you see blue, right? They don't see that, they just see brown. So that's basically, you know, what's going on in Iowa with our soil. You know, the UN says we have about 60 harvests left. I don't know exactly what that means. I've been trying to understand what that means, because like, does that mean like 60 harvests as in like 60 years, or 60 harvests as in like 2 or 3 harvests per year? So I'm not really sure, but that to me still seems very scary. If you look at aerial views of our soil, you can see like over the years how, like, you know, the darkness is going away. And also, you know, because of what we've done to the land here, we've released immense amounts of carbon into the air by, like, you know, cutting all this, you know, taking everything away. The goal for Great Plains Action Society is to rematriate prairie and to get Indigenous and you know, other BIPOC folks, you know, back into farming, because as this video that I showed says, we need Indigenous ways of leading the way for a regenerative future. And you know, we have been working for quite some time on what we call our Slopes and Wetlands project, which we hope, and this is a massive project, and we don't know if it's actually ever going to come to fruition, where we can, you know, rematriate slopes where they are over 9%, and like basically all 5-mile floodplains, so that these areas remain just remain with what's naturally supposed to be there. And what that means is, you know, farmers can no longer, you know, plant, you know, on like a riverbank, right? Because they do that because they know they're going to get, you know, insurance when it inevitably floods, or, you know, on a slope when it inevitably fails, because there's, like, in my opinion, like a welfare scam going on here. Like farmers are basically like taking advantage of a system that you know, and they may not even realize they're taking advantage of it, right? Like, it's just a system that's in place that like needs to change. And then we're hoping that we could like change the conservation reserve program so that, like, you know, things are just permanently in place, so that places that need to be like preserved for the reasons of keeping our soil in place just stay that way. So that's a huge long-term massive project, but I do have to say we have some folks that we're working with that honestly want to help us make this happen, and it seems like it could possibly come true. So we'll see. We're working on also building a Indigenous-led land trust program here in Iowa, which would be very groundbreaking and make a big difference in who owns the land, because 98% of agricultural land in this country is owned by white people, and in Iowa that's got to be more like 99.5%, right? And honestly, that's why we're in the predicament that we're in, because these colonial capitalist farming practices are brought like a complete breakdown to our environment. And I feel like Iowa is at an end stage right now, and we have to do something very quickly in order to save what we have. So hi kitata mihin, thank you for listening to me, and I will pass it on to I don't know, back to Jen or Carolyn, I'm not really sure. So
I can take it from here.
okay.
So you know, Sikowis really opened up a kind of frame for us to think about even our own bodies, that this body that you inhabit is really made from the earth, from soil, and you will return to it at some point. This is worth cherishing and worth treating the body of the earth in that same way. So I want to give you 2 images to start with. One is this orange that I have my show and tell for tonight. And I once asked a friend of mine if he believed in God or the creator. And he said, if you imagine that an orange can arise out of the soil from the sun and water, that the soil can create this. It can create this. And at the same time, soil can kill you. And if you doubt that, it just killed 6 people in Illinois. When that massive dust storm arose and created that massive traffic jam and set of accidents, our farming practices can kill you. This is a public health statement. That dust, the earth is meant to have a marriage with water, and water at a certain tempo. It is meant to have a certain relationship with the air. And what we've done is undermined all of those relationships of the soil to the other elements. We've speeded up water with our tiling. We've speeded it up with, we don't have as many days that are where we have frozen water, which is a way of slowing water down. We've accelerated all of these geologic processes with accelerating water. And this earth, that soil, is a wilderness all of its own. The wild microorganisms that inhabit a teaspoonful of soil. And what we've done is killed those entire communities with those pesticides that Sikowis described, with the herbicides, with the fungicides, with the insecticides that we've filled that soil with, the fertilizer where we have altered the biochemical relationships of all of those organisms, the basic geochemical processes of life that give rise to healthy plants. We've taken away the very health of the soil, and that's the basis of the health of the plants that are supposed to be nourishing us. And so what we have done is undermined our health and the health of our communities with how we have filled our soils with toxic chemicals, with over-fertilizing it. So the nitrates that we put into the soil lead to contaminated water, and then diseases like blue baby syndrome for our children if they drink too much of the water. It interferes with our oxygen uptake. And so when you look at what we have done to the soil, and when Sikowis said, this is the most colonialized state, it's the most biologically altered state in the Union. We've done that. And at some point, we're going to have reached a tipping point where the soils, the absence of pollinators, where the destruction of our water, all tied together with the health of the soil or the ill health of the soil. And it's up to us. You know, I'm a lawyer, and I think about what the law is. The law is the set of rules a community agrees to be bound by. And I don't know about you, but I did not agree to be bound by laws that allow for the destruction of our soil. We don't have a Clean Soil Act. We have a Clean Water Act. We have a Clean Air Act. We don't have a Clean Soil Act. We don't have a way of thinking about the soil in Iowa and how it is the foundation of public health, along with our water, along with our air, and it's all tied together. That when you begin breathing the air, when they are putting the fertilizer, when they're putting the manure down from the confined animal feeding operations, the CAFOs, and they're spreading the manure in such a way on a windy day, you are now inhaling those antibiotics. You are inhaling that particulate matter. And that is not what our relationship to the earth is meant to be. And so we are developing antibiotic resistance in our human communities because we are breathing the soil rather than eating the plants that are healthy and from the soil. And we are drinking water contaminated with all of that residue that's washed with the soil. And we're sending it down to the Gulf of Mexico, where it is creating a dead zone in the Gulf, interfering with the fish, It's all connected. And so what we are doing with the way that we are farming, causing us to breathe that soil, causing it to pollute the water, it is undermining the fundamentals of public health and our individual medical health. Public health is the health of all of us, how we share health. My health is actually connected to your health. If I have a bad cold and breathe on your face, all of a sudden we have a public health situation rather than just my individual health. And what we have done in Iowa, by the way that we treat our soil as dirt, rather than the life-giving element that it is meant to be, we are fundamentally destroying the health of our communities, of our land, of our animals. So, there's a lot of ways to think about the rules that we will agree to be bound by. We're Democrats. Many of you are Democrats. And we can think about the rules that we want to be bound by. Environmental law is fundamentally the law of giving people the right to pollute. We don't think about the law and the role of government as taking care of the things that we share. That government should be the caretaker, the steward, the guardian of the things that we share, including soil, including public health, and especially public health. That if we measured the success of government by public health, we would start with how we treat water in Iowa and how we treat the soil. And the last thing I want to say, in deference to Sikowis, having spoken about the colonial world, that the brilliance of indigenous ways of thinking is that all of these plants, animals, soil, rivers, water are our relatives. Imagine if we treated the soil as a relative. I have certain rights and responsibilities with my spouse. I have certain rights if I was a child with my siblings or my grandparents. Imagine reconsidering and reconfiguring environmental law so it wasn't just giving people the right to pollute, but imagine that we made it family law. And if we called the soil a relative or the Mississippi River a relative, what kind of relationship would we establish with not just our rights, our individual rights, but our responsibilities as these big-brained mammals that make the laws that we agree to be bound by? We need to devote a lot more imagination to the laws that we agree to govern our life together. And it's one of the places that I think Iowans may do well, to sit together and imagine what should be in our platforms. Should we have a Clean Soil Act? Should we reimagine environmental law so that rights and responsibilities overrode the property right to pollute? Shouldn't my right to be born without being polluted, without having the toxic chemicals that are born through air and water that cross the placenta into that baby, shouldn't that baby have a right to be born without being polluted with those pesticides, that fertilizer, and have a right to live? We can reimagine this based on the soil, starting with the soil, starting with that wilderness, that skin of the earth, to give rise to a new imagination, because we live in the most damaged state. We have already lost the most. We can only start on an upward trajectory from here. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jen, for inviting me into the Heartland for this forum. And I'm really pleased and honored to be on this webinar with Sikowis and Carolyn, two really great experts in their field when we were talking about soil. And so I grew up on a farm in Northeast Iowa, and I farmed with my family for 10 years before I ended up getting involved in politics. And that's how I ended up in Des Moines, working for the Environmental Law and Policy Center, really as a lobbyist. And so I'm working with policymakers at the state level and also a bit at the federal level. So EOPC is headquartered in Chicago, and I'm located here in Des Moines, working here with policymakers. And one of the, as a farmer, I can talk to the farmer legislators about the price of corn. I can talk about productivity. I can talk about the growing season, the weather. But if I start talking about water quality, and that's one of our priority areas, they see an environmental guy pointing their finger at them. And while I may want to feel like I want to do that, I won't get very far talking to Republicans who are in the majority. And so what I have learned to do, instead of talking about water quality, I talk about soil health. That is a whole different conversation. Then it's about profitability per acre, best practices, no-till farming, cover crops, all of the things that we know that will help, as had been talked about before. The soil is, I think of the microorganisms and everything in the soil as livestock. We need to farm that livestock in the soil and not disrupt their habitat, because the habitat is harmed by, as Carolyn said, went through, with the list of chemicals and synthetic fertilizers. But also it's about tilling the field, running a cultivator or a disc or a chisel plow through the field disrupts that habitat, and all of the livestock and the critters that live in the soil, they don't thrive when you do that. So one of the best things we can do in agriculture is no-till farming. We just don't disturb the soil. Because every time you disturb the soil, you release carbon into the atmosphere and you disrupt the habitat for all the critters that live in the soil. So agriculture in Iowa accounts for 29% of carbon into the atmosphere. That is the highest sector in Iowa that releasing carbon into the atmosphere is agriculture. Now, carbon can also be sequestered by the process of photosynthesis, growing green things, trees, plants, crops can sequester carbon. Now, there's a lot of science behind carbon sequestration in agriculture. It's very complex and it's very difficult to measure. But nonetheless, we know that we can do that by following soil health best practices. So that's some of the policy I'm working on with some legislators. And that's what I want to add, from my perspective. It's, trying to get policy that will give farmers the tools to not release carbon into the atmosphere, but also to sequester carbon and to really pay attention to soil health. Because what do we get when we pay attention to soil health? Well, healthier crops. You don't need as much fertilizer. There's some farmers that have been no-till farming for over 20 years that they don't use fertilizer anymore because of the organic matter in the soil is built up to such a level, the crops thrive without putting on synthetic fertilizer. So it's important to just communicate that there's a better way to earn a living as a farmer, and we get then cleaner water. Now, cleaning up the water in Iowa is going to take a long time. It's not something that, if you look at a large watershed like the Raccoon River Valley watershed with hundreds of thousands of acres, we're not going to see an improvement in water quality. If every farmer in the watershed went to no-till tomorrow, we won't see improvement in the water monitoring to monitor for several years or longer. It could be 10 years or longer. Some scientists have said it could be 20 years before we see any improvement. But if you start to look at smaller watersheds, they're like 4,000 acre watersheds, you can start to see improvements rather quickly by just changing and being more conservation minded and paying attention to soil health. So one of the bills that I've been working with some Republican legislators on that are farmers is, you know, every county has a soil and water, a water and soil conservation district is in every county. And so the SWCDs, what they focus on is it's T-loss. T-loss means tons per is tolerable for soil to be lost, per acre. Well, really, the T-loss should be set at 0 and focus on soil health. And so that's what this legislation introduces. Soil health is one of the strategies and duties of soil and water conservation districts, that they should help farmers adapt conservation practices on their land. We got that bill, went through the House with support by all legislators in the House, but it got stalled in the Senate for political reasons. So we're going to come back next year, that bill through the Senate. That will be a step in the right direction. Is it going to solve our water quality issue? No, but we need all hands on deck. And we need soil and water conservation districts and all of the commissioners, which everybody here votes for soil and water conservation commissioners. Pay attention to who you're voting for when you see your ballot, because it makes a difference. So we need their help in helping improve soil health, which will then in water quality. So I'm going to stop there, Jen, and because I know we have a series of questions, and I want to have a chance to answer the questions that the participants have this evening.
Okay, I am back, and I wanted to see if we might have just lost Sikowis. We might have just lost Sikowis. I can't tell right now. So I think if she's still on, I would love to hear. My question is a two-part question. One is, I'm struck by the angles and approach of how each of you addresses the issue of the many issues our soil has here. And I'm curious, first, how widely adopted practices like no-till farming have become. I'm remembering research from like Chris Jones and Sylvia Secchi talking about all the money left on the table with certain initiatives to get farmers to sign up for such practices. So number one, I'm curious about the popularity of those and what you're encountering there. I think, Steve, that's largely for you, but that's also for everybody. And I think too, I'd like to hear more about land back initiatives for bigger picture. How can we steer the ship? I'm thinking about the 5,000 years it would take to reach the goal if we follow the current nutrient reduction strategy, and 60 harvests less. So those are my one and two. Take however, and chime in however you'd like.
Well, I'll start off with about how many acres in Iowa, or how many farmers use no-till farming. When I was farming in the late 80s, boy, I look around the neighborhood, I can't remember. I mean, there were maybe one or two in the neighborhood that were thinking about it or experimenting with it. But actually, the data for today, 36% of Iowa farmers now are no-till. So when we talk about, instead of talking about productivity per acre, which is how many bushels of corn can I raise per acre, the conversation with soil health is profitability per acre, because you're not spending as much money on input costs. So after a period of 3 to 5 years of no-till, you start to, your productivity picks back up to where you were when you were pouring on synthetic fertilizer. So that profitability per acre is really important. So 41% of farmers do conservation planting. Now, I'm not sure what that definition, what that means, if that's all just strip till or other tillage methods that are more conservation tillage and not the traditional tillage that we kind of see prevalent throughout Iowa. Now, where we really need to make more progress is with cover crops. We should have something growing on the landscape year round. I mean, even under the snow cover, there should be cover crops under there so they can, pop up in the spring. And that's where we really fall behind. And so while the nutrient reduction strategy is now, I think, 8 years old in Iowa, it just not has adapted cover crops. We hear the data on how many millions of acres now are cover crops. Well, it's like, a drop in the bucket to where we should be at. So you're right, Jen, it will take a long time under the voluntary structure of the nutrient reduction strategy before we will even make a dent.
So I do want to say, just follow up, the soil doesn't want to be naked. It wants to be dressed. It wants those wonderful plants, the roots anchoring it, the leaves covering it. It doesn't want to be naked. It should not be naked. And the current limited number of things that we grow in Iowa is a poverty. It impoverishes the soil. And until we move in the direction of more organic agriculture, which requires a much more diverse kind of crop rotation, until we employ many of these practices, if we're going to just grow corn for ethanol and put in CO2 pipelines, and capture the CO2 and just continue this treadmill, Iowa is going to go downhill. It is going to get worse. And so we need to employ all of the practices that we know actually work, from cover crops and no-till and strips and not farming on slopes, returning as much as possible to prairie, growing more perennials, whether it's nuts or other things. We are going to have to change this, and the political will is missing in the larger political discourse. So we're seeing wonderful things with Practical Farmers of Iowa, with Women Food and Agriculture Network, with many organizations that are promoting different ways of thinking about this. And I think that the CO2 pipeline discussion has opened up some new wiggle room around ethanol. Are we going to keep raising essentially gasoline on our farms? We're going to start raising food for people. And how are we going to think about that mix of what we are actually growing on this land and how we use that soil? So we've got a long way to go. And without, I think, a shift in the political landscape, we are going to see that increase in the cancer rate. We are going to see an increase in cardiovascular diseases and upper respiratory problems from our poor air quality from breathing these things. We're going to see more diseases that are antibiotic resistant. We're going to see pandemics arise because of the way that we're raising animals, that we should not be, we're creating the conditions for terrible public health. And we're just going to have to make the shifts as we can. We're going to have to do the incremental, and we're going to have to do the rapid revolutionary shifts as well.
I would just like to add on to what Carolyn mentioned about health consequences of nitrates in water and the increased risk of cancer. I have a fact sheet that I use with policymakers, and I heard Dr. Peter Weyer a few years ago speak. He's from the University of Iowa, and he has done the Women's Health Survey for over 20 years. So he has longitudinal data, and what he has found when it comes to postmenopausal women, drinking water with nitrate levels below 10 milligrams per liter, because I think, Jen, you mentioned about blue baby syndrome, or somebody did, that
I did.
Above, yeah, Carolyn, that above 10 milligrams per liter, you get blue baby, below 10, you don't. So that's why EPA sets it at 10. But what Dr. Weyer found was that even at rates below 10, like at 6 or 5, over a period of years, 3 to 5 to 8 years, the increased risk of cancer to postmenopausal women, ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer, increased by double in some in some cancers. So there is a definite health consequence. So that study was just women, but that translates to men too. So when I share that information with policymakers, it's I can kind of tell what reaction I'm going to get. If it's a man who is a farmer, what I'm showing him and telling him is kind of like going in one ear and out the other. But if it's a Republican woman, their eyes get big and they say, I had no idea that that was a risk, like, in what we drink. So that's why I'm a big supporter of electing more women to the legislature and to Congress, just because I think they are better at policymaking than men are. So, and I used to be a man in the legislature, and I think women are much better suited to be policymakers than men. So, to the next question.
The way we're farming can be lethal. If it can increase your risk of cancer, if you're going to be the 1 in 100 that gets a pancreatic cancer, you're going to go fast. And if you're a woman who gets pancreatic cancer, you will not see your grandchild graduate from high school or get married. That's just the facts. If you are driving in a windstorm like that in Illinois, you can die. If you're a grandmother and your baby is drinking that drinking water with high nitrates, your grandbaby may die. Do we want to live like this? Or do we want to change how we are treating this precious, precious earth?
Thank you both for that. In taking that and continuing on, we had a question that came in asking about how and who might be able to help people establish their property as learning centers for sustainability and innovative agriculture, or if they don't want to go that big, then how can they start gathering up more resources about how to change the way that they're doing things?
Boy, I wish I knew. Talking to your legislator, that's the world I come from, is through the political lens. I have a tendency to look at everything through that lens. Boy, it sure makes a difference in who we vote for. And even if we have a policymaker that was elected that we didn't vote for, you still need to develop a relationship with them. And that's how you can change minds. It took me 5 years developing a relationship with Republican farmers before I was able to start talking about the benefits of soil health. It isn't something that they're going to get right away, but it takes time. You have to be patient, but that's how, we got this bill passed through the House with no votes against it. And the ag groups were silent on the bill. They weren't actively working against it, but they also weren't for it, and they should have been. But it's about developing relationships. That's what I've learned in my years so far as working with policymakers.
So I want to follow up on the question of how would you go about making your acreage something that is sustainable and a place where people can come and learn and experience it? So some of it's, you must know a lot about how to do that just because you're thinking about it. And you're going to enter a labyrinth. You're going to encounter dead ends and strange and wonderful turns. And so what I would suggest is, if you're going to not get killed by the Minotaur, which are probably the economic dogs that can kill a certain kind of agriculture, you can talk to Extension. You can talk to some of the great minds, that Women, Food and Agriculture and Practical Farmers of Iowa. There are people out there who have made some attempts at and are trying to make their places more sustainable and learning centers. The Garsts with the White Rock Conservancy, you might visit them to see one model. But what I would do is put on your explorer's hat and find out what's out there. And then I would trust your own intuition about what you know is needed. Whatever has given you that idea, that's the string that's going to get you through that labyrinth.
Thank you for that and taking a different tack and maybe as a different sort of lawyerly attack. We have a question from AJ Jones that says, can we sue the state for endangering our lives like this? And I had been hearing about ecocide and worldwide potentials for this. What are the potentials for this here?
Well, let me just point out that Illinois, right next door, right, the place that just had the soil kill a bunch of people, or our farming practices, I should say our farming practices weaponize the soil. Don't weaponize the soil. That's the first rule of living in a place. In Illinois, they have a right to a clean and healthy environment written into their state constitution, and we do not. That means that our rights are different right over the Mississippi River. We have fewer rights to a clean and healthy environment in Iowa than they do in Illinois. It would be very difficult to sue the state. Nevertheless, we should be thinking about using all the branches of government. We should be looking at all avenues to claim our rights to live without being damaged by the subsidies we're giving to corn, the subsidies we're giving to CAFOs, by allowing these practices to continue. And so, the courts have a place, and it will be up to very creative litigators to figure out how to use the courts. The legislature right now is, as far as I can tell, has turned against public health. Their basic philosophy is that the economy can solve all problems. And if you think that the economy is solving these problems of public health and how we are suffering from agriculture, not this legislature. And then we have the administrative branch. And so we have to use all of those. And then I think actually that it's nonprofits that are coming up with not in government nonprofits that are coming up with so many of the really innovative solutions. You asked 3 nonprofits to speak here. And, the university right now are almost wholly owned subsidiaries of corporations. And so where I see the innovation coming in terms of policy, in terms of agricultural practices, are coming out of the nonprofits. So look to nonprofits for the innovation that we seek to bring about health.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. That would have been an amazing place to leave it. And there's one more question if we've got time. And that is a question about Iowa's current soil fertility rate. I know we've lost a lot of topsoil, and what is the remaining like?
We've impoverished it. I don't know the exact numbers, maybe Steve does, but what we're left with now is disastrous. And I'm working at building soil in my little yard with compost. I'm so keenly interested in how we make soil. The compost process is so different from how the forest does it. It just layers leaves and they decay, and it's slower than that kind of churning process that I'm using with compost. And yet we know how many inches, feet we have washed out of Iowa or blown away. So I don't know the exact numbers, and maybe Steve does, but what I know is that we have impoverished our soil. And that is not a legacy that we as responsible ancestors can leave to future generations.
Yeah, I would like to see farmers test their soil for organic matter and the amount of carbon in their soil rather than fertility. When I was farming, I would test for fertility. Oh, I need to put X number of pounds of fertilizer on every year. Well, some studies are showing that over half of the fertilizer that's put on your farm field is lost due to being lost in the atmosphere, being lost through erosion, particular matter, soil blowing away, or through water. And so we're just over applying to make up with synthetic fertilizer to make up for what we've lost naturally. So I don't know what the number is after, the natural fertility of soil, but I agree with Carolyn. It is devastating and that's why so much, farmers want to pour on the fertilizer so that they can get 200 and 250 bushel acre corn.
I know
Go ahead, sorry.
running out of time. And I want to speak to each one of you that's listening today and say, look for the creative ways that you can tend the soil, remembering that you are made out of it, whether it's adding to compost, whether it is planting native prairie plants in your yard, whatever it is, think about something that you can do to tend and nurture the soil. And when you watch it blow away on the fields, mourn, mourn. We need some collective sorrow, some rituals for sorrow, and then hold our elected officials and our appointed, our agencies accountable for what they have done and what they think they're going to get away with. We as a group, as a collective, cannot let them get away with this.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, get involved. And once again, I'd like to thank Sikowis Nobiss, Carolyn Raffensperger, Steve Falck for sharing their time, experience, and education with us this evening. Another big thank you to those helping behind the scenes, Kathy Focht, Suzanne Kabish, and Sarah Smith. Kathy will send out an email to everyone who registered with the links for both the Facebook and the YouTube videos, as well as the resources mentioned here tonight, and there were plenty. If you haven't yet, you can sign up for the very last session in this Earth to Iowa series at heartofiowadems.com/register. On May 10th, we'll cover the many ramifications of climate change on food